As you, I hope, already know, the restoration of independence of all three Baltic states is connected to collapsing of the Soviet Union in 1990, 1991, and also the restitution of churches' property in Latvia is connected to the restoration of the statehood. So we will start with a brief introduction to the process of the restoration of independence. Then we will observe shortly the state which had to be restored. Then briefly we will see the consequences of the Soviet occupation, and at the end the process of restoration of independence and restoration of churches' properties. So, as I already mentioned, the independence was partly restored already at 1990 due to adoption of the Declaration of 4th May on 1990 by the Supreme Council, and in its preamble, the Supreme Council stated that the inclusion of the Republic of Latvia in the Soviet Union is not enforced from the point of view of international law, and the Republic of Latvia still exists de jure as a subject of international law, which is acknowledged by more than 50 countries of the world. So main wording still exists without interruptions. And also in preamble to the Constitution of the Republic of Latvia in paragraph 3 is established that the people of Latvia did not recognize the occupation regimes, resisted them, and regained their freedom by restoring national independence on 4th May 1990 on the basis of continuity of the state. So the state existed without interruption. The Soviet occupation is mistake and not existed de jure, and mostly the Soviet acts, all Soviet acts and actions are invalid. So the independence legally was restored in means of doctrine of continuity, which is very important in case of restoration of property rights and also restoration of property rights of churches on confiscated properties during the Soviet period. But what had to be restored? It is the main question, because already after establishing the Latvian state in 1918, as a result of the First World War, collapsing of Russian Empire, and at least the November Revolution in Germany, the state was established, and the main task of a new government was to ensure a social peace because of widespread communism ideas among population. And what was the problem? The problem was that till establishing the state, only 40% of all lands were owned by peasants. Almost 50% of lands were owned by immatriculated nobility. A little bit more than 1% of lands were owned by pastorates, which also legally were manors, as manors of immatriculated nobility. And only 10% of lands were owned by crown or by state itself. So, and it wasn't enough, 10%, it wasn't enough to grant the peasants, landless peasants the land. And therefore, already on 16 September 1920, the convocation, the Constituent Assembly adopted the land reform law. According to it, the state land fund was established, and the state land fund consisted of crown or state lands, manors, and forests, and included also the lands of the pastorates. So mainly pastorates, it's properties of Lutheran Evangelical Church in Baltic provinces and also in Latvia. However, also few exceptions were provided. The former owners were allowed to hold properties of 50 hectares. Cemeteries and lands on which churches and monasteries are built also were excluded, together with the yards, buildings, and gardens attached to the churches and monasteries, lands of the Catholic Aglena monastery as a part of settlement with the Catholic minority in eastern Latvia, and also inventory belonging to the users of pastoral estates and churches' lands. I would like to say that pastorates was not a property of priests or of pastors. It was a property of parishes, which was in proprietary use of pastors to maintain their lifestyle. And as a result, in case of pastorates, approximately 84% of their previous properties were confiscated at that time. So they owned after this first land reform, after the establishing of Latvian state, only 12,000 of hectares of land. And the state was to be established after restoration of the independence. The Soviet occupation started on 17th June 1940, and already on 22nd July 1940, of newly elected People's Saima, People Parliament, Communistic Parliament, it had adopted the declaration on the proclamation of the people's ownership of land, according to which the land with its riches, forests, lakes, and rivers is the property of the whole people, the property of the state. Next week, the land law was adopted and the new state land fund established, according to which also all lands of churches, parishes, and monasteries, regardless of their area, had to be included in that fund. However, not the buildings. But in 1 year, in March 1941, the decision of the government came in force on the inventory and valuation of buildings for worship in the territory of the Latvian SSR, according to which all buildings of churches and other houses were included in the inventory, and after on contractual basis given to churches for further use. After the war in 1946, the decree on the use of places of worship was adopted. It was a precise instruction for the use of church buildings and other buildings for religious worship activities, and it also prevented from arbitrary confiscation of church properties by the local authorities. However, it also restricted the legal personality of churches. But after already in 50s, 60s, and 70s, many buildings of churches were transferred to public institutions, organizations, and companies. So we see, for example, the Orthodox Cathedral in Riga, which in 60s years was transferred to the public authorities and converted to planetarium. And the second image is the Lutheran Cathedral in Riga, the dominant of old city of Riga, and in 1963 it was converted to the concert hall. So it's not so bad in comparison to conversion into storages, for example. And the third image, it is also the church in Old Riga, Saint Peter's Church, and it will also, after its restoration in 70s, was converted into a concert hall. However, as I said, after adoption of Declaration and the restoration of independence, the reform had to be made. And already on 13th June 1990, the decision on land reform in the Republic of Latvia was adopted. Few months later, the law on religious organizations was adopted, and according to this law, the churches regained their legal personality, their property rights were recognized, and also the law included the declaration of restoration of previous properties, but with reference to a law that had yet to be adopted. And that law was adopted 2 years later, in 1992. This law was based on 9 principles. Our first principle and main principle, restoration of property rights on both immovable and movable. Of course, with some exceptions. For example, in case if some buildings were destroyed during the Second World War. Second principle, protection of property rights of bona fide acquirers during a period from 1940 till 1945. Third principle, compensation if restoration is impossible, and there were two arts of compensation. First part, granting another land, and second art, pecuniary compensation. Firstly, restoration of property rights within a religious organization, and it was actually very challenging because during adoption of a law there were discussions whether the parish itself has a right to the property and the building, or the religious organization itself. And for example, some deputies said that only parishes and only that parishes that had members from a pre-occupational period. Of course, this concept was not adopted, and the solution was that firstly, parishes has a right to reclaim their properties, and if there is not a parish anymore, the religious organization itself, for example, in case of evangelical church, the consistory, and in case of Catholic church, the Catholic Courier in Riga. Fifthly, the determination of the successor. As I said, it was very challenging. It was the first law which granted the right to reclaim properties for legal persons, not for natural persons, but for legal persons. Restoration of ownership through an administrative procedure. A decision had to be made by the relevant local authority. seventhly, extinguishing of claims between churches and previous holders. So neither churches had claims against previous holders. No previous holders had claims against churches, for example, for maintenance of the buildings or houses. Time limits for the restitution of property, however, in 1994 these time limits were prolonged. Why these time limits were very meaningful? Because it was only a first part of economical transformation, restoration of properties. Second part of the land reform generally was privatization of properties. And privatization of properties, it was able to perform it only after process of restoration of properties. And also guarantees for tenants. It's a social part of this reform. So they remain, the right of tenants were not restricted. And ninthly, guarantees for recourse to the court to settle disputes and exempting religious organizations from court costs. However, there were some exceptions. The decision on the procedure for the entry into force of the law on the restitution of properties to religious organizations exempted the Riga Cathedral and St. Peter's Church and ownership rights. In case of that, two main churches in the Old Riga were resolved accordingly only in 2005 and 2022. Thank you for your attention.